Hello everyone. So in the last few videos we have covered the introduction to the demand and supply model, and we also spoke about the demand side, wherein we talked about the changes in quantity demanded and also the change in demand. So I showed you the difference between movement along the demand curve and shifts of the demand curve, what factors may cause the shift of the demand curve. So your main takeaway there was, if price changes with everything else in the market staying constant, where everything else refers to the non-price factors, then you get a movement along the demand curve, which is referred to as the change in quantity demanded. However, if the price stays constant and some of those other non-price factors change, which we termed as the tribe factors, then you get shifts of the demand curve, and that is known as change in demand. Now today we are still on module 2 unit 1, but today we are going to talk about the supply side of the market in isolation. We will follow the same routine that we followed on the demand side, which means we are going to talk about the movements along the supply curve, and then we will talk about the shifts in the supply curve. So now we are basically looking at the same things. So we are looking at the quantity and price relationship, but the only difference is that now we are looking at it from the seller's perspective or the supplier's perspective. So we will call the quantity here quantity supplied, and we will denote it as QS. Let's call that quantity supplied, where quantity supplied is basically defined as the quantity that the sellers are willing and able to sell. Please note that it is a similar definition to what we had on the demand side for buyers. Once again, there are two important things to note here: the willingness and the ability of the sellers. So here we are not just referring to what the sellers are willing to sell, but it is also backed by their ability, which means that what price are they willing and able to accept for that quantity. Okay, so we are looking at the relationship between this quantity supplied and the own price, but we are doing that from the seller's perspective, where own price is the price of the commodity. So now if you consider yourself to be a seller and think about a selling situation very intuitively, then you can understand that as price of the commodity increases, the sellers would be willing to sell more of the good, right? Because they can make more money by selling the good now. However, as the price of the good drops, the sellers will be willing to sell less of the good now. Once again, that is just rational for the seller to do, and everything else in the market staying constant, everything else, and now you know that by everything else I am referring to the non-price factors in the market. So the non-price factors in the market staying constant, if the price of the commodity increases, then the quantity supplied increases. If the price of the commodity decreases, then the quantity supplied decreases, right? And this is known as the law of supply. This positive relationship between the price of the commodity and the quantity supplied of the commodity is known as the law of supply. And when we graphically represent this law of supply, it is known as the supply curve. So the supply curve is nothing but a graphical representation of the law of supply, and in this class we will call the supply curve the S curve. So the demand curve was the D curve, and the supply curve in this class is the S curve. So once we have established the law of supply, next we are going to look at the mechanism behind this law of supply. That is, how do we get this positive relationship on the supply curve when we represent it on the two-dimensional space where we have quantity on the x-axis and price on the y-axis. But before we get there, I want you to refresh your memory and think about how we got the market demand curve from individual demand curves. If you remember, we had three buyers, Jack, John and Joe, and when we aggregated horizontally their quantity demanded, we got the market demand curve for all those buyers for that good in the market. Similarly, on the supply side, we can derive the market supply curve, which is of interest to us, from individual supply curves by horizontally adding up the quantity supplied by all sellers of that commodity in the market. Okay, so that means market demand curve is the aggregated demand of all buyers of the commodity in the market, and the market supply curve is the aggregated quantity supplied of all sellers of the commodity in the market. Now please note that it is macro in the sense that we are aggregating all buyers and all sellers, but it is micro in the sense that we are only dealing with the market for one particular commodity. Okay, so in the next section we are going to move forward and we are going to talk about the movement along the supply curve.